So how about we get started and let people join as they come? So welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm really excited for the conversation today. So let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Jasmin Church, and I am the president of the Princeton Africa Alumni Board. I was a Princeton Africa Fellow 2015 to 2016 in Kampala, Uganda, working with Electra Limited, and I am currently in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is where I live. Today, I think we're in for a real treat. We are having the Alumni Board's first in conversation with event of 2022. And we have a very special guest, Damilola Akinyele. She is Princeton Africa's new executive director. Dami, thank you for joining us. And please set me straight if I mispronounced your name. And yeah, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Jasmin, and good to see everyone who's joined since we started this conversation. Looking forward to getting to know you all at some point during this conversation. And yes, you are saying my name correctly. You're saying it with an American twang, but you're saying it correctly.
I'm doing my best. I'm doing what I can. I'm doing what I can. So as many of you may know, Dami joined Princeton in Africa in September 2021, I believe. I might have my month a little bit off. But I think it's been roughly 6 months, and I am really excited because a lot of the time you don't really get the opportunity to get to know the person who is leading an organization that might be really near and dear to your heart. And so I think it's a great opportunity for all the alumni, all the stakeholders who believe in Princeton in Africa and have stake in Princeton in Africa. It's a great opportunity for us to just kind of get to know Dami a little bit better. And I also want to caveat that this is not going to be like an extremely professional experience background conversation. I don't think that would be as valuable. I would like to, just get more understanding of who Dami is, the person, the leader, and also understand what her vision is for Princeton in Africa. And I think that we all would benefit from that as well. So just briefly for today's discussion, we will spend the first 45 minutes going through some prepared questions for Dami. And then we will open up the floor to the viewers to have you ask some questions that might be burning for you as well. And one last thing before we jump in, if you are interested in learning more about the expat life or journey of someone living in South Africa like myself, or if you're interested in learning about all of the traveling throughout the continent that I've been doing over the last few years, please subscribe to my YouTube channel that just launched this week. There's going to be some great content, and I feel like this is the perfect crowd to actually follow and get some valuable tips and tricks as an expat living on the continent. So just wanted to plug that before we jump into things. And yeah, get started. So to kick us off, Dami, how about you share a little bit of your background? So let's include personal, professional, give us some highlights. Who are you? Where are you from? How did you grow up? Give us a little bit background with Dami.
Thank you for the big existential question. Hi again, everyone.
Who are you?
Who are you? My name is Damilola Elizabeth Akinyele. All of that is very long, so I invite people to call me Dami. I was born and raised in Lagos, Nigeria. It's in the southwestern part of Nigeria. And I came to the United States when I was 16 to go to Morgan State University. It's a historically Black college and university in Baltimore, Maryland. When I was at Morgan, I studied sociology and anthropology with a pre-law concentration. I do come from a family of lawyers, and I always wanted to go to law school, or so I thought, until I arrived at Morgan State University. And that was really pivotal in my journey and just what I wanted to do with my career long term. After Morgan, very much like African parents, there was a very strong resistance to not going to law school. So that was a very big deal. I was like, okay, I'll prove to you that I can do this. I'm not doing it because I can't. So I spent some time working at DLA Piper and studying to take the exam for law school. And at that time when I worked at DLA Piper, they saw that I was having this experience, but it wasn't what I wanted to do, long term or with my life. I decided to get a master's in international training, development, and education. So I went to American University in Washington, D.C. I got my master's from there. And I stayed in DC since then. So I've been in the nonprofit space in Washington, DC. I worked at 2 different nonprofits, IRX and World Learning. A lot of my work at those nonprofits is implementing U.S. Department of State programs. So some of the programs were similar to Princeton in Africa as fellowship programs. Others were more diplomatic and geared towards leadership. So I did that for a number of years in DC. I also consult for the Ministry of Education in Nigeria. So a lot of my work also involves working with the government and institutions in Nigeria. My expertise has always been the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and some Africa, that I was born and raised on the continent. So I made this pivot, and I also worked at a faith-based nonprofit. So right before I came to Princeton in Africa, I was managing the operations for faith-based nonprofits in the U.S. And then I came to Princeton in Africa. So it's been an interesting career over the last 10, 11 years, I will say. So really excited to be here at Princeton in Africa. On a personal side, I will say that I enjoy art. So for all of you who have never been to Nigeria, this is my plug to go at some point. Lagos has a really huge art scene that's just blowing up. Really incredible art, African art, incredible artists, very interesting stories. And so I quite enjoy that. I collect some that I can afford. I like bookstores. So I lived in DC for a while. Some of my favorite bookstores in DC, Sankofa, Buff Boys and Puss, Politics and Bros sometimes. I enjoy traveling and I enjoy canoeing. Would also like to answer any questions as they come, but that's me. And those are some of the things that I enjoy personally and professionally.
Love it. And I heard you say that you went to Morgan State, which is an HBCU. So shout out to the HBCUs. I went to Spelman. How would you say attending an HBCU after growing up in Nigeria impacted your sense of identity or your sense of race and even your professional trajectory as well?
I do have to say that Morgan State University is the best HBCU in the country. No shade to
You're the guest. You're the guest. I'm gonna let you
else.
have it. You're the guest. I'm gonna let you have it. But shout out to Spelman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would say that going to Morgan, those were some of the most defining years for my life, for me as a person. And then professionally, right? So when I first came to Morgan, there are all these big questions. When I first came to Morgan, it wasn't my first time in the United States, but it was my first time as someone who was not on holiday. but you actually live in the United States. You're navigating a new country, you're navigating race, you're navigating what it looks like to be a young person who has just moved to a completely different continent with no backbone. And being in Morgan for me was really important because I really got to immerse myself in history. I would say history from an African perspective. You know, a lot of our own history that we don't even teach, you know, in some of our institutions, and being at Morgan and learning that, and also learning the African American experience, being a part of that, and shaping my own identity and some of the things that I'm passionate about and things that I want to do. So I was saying earlier that, you know, I come from a family of lawyers. It was set, I'm going to law school. When I came to Morgan, I remember a class that I took in my sophomore year. It was a global ethics class. And that was the first time that I was really confronted, you know, with some of the big challenges that we face on the African continent. So from the personal side, you know, I was already being challenged. And then from the intellectual side, Morgan really opened up this world for me where I started to see the world differently, started to question my assumptions, my purpose, my role. It was really important being there. And then I've also, you know, since Morgan, or while I was at Morgan, so, you know, while you're at Morgan, you have different internships. I had different internship experiences. And then coming out of Morgan and navigating spaces that were predominantly white, I will say that it was challenging, but, you know, having come from a place where you've seen so many people that look like you who are excellent at what they do, you have that confidence in yourself. You also have a certain sort of respect for, you know, other people and other cultures and how you navigate and how you relate with people. So I'm really grateful for, you know, that Morgan experience. And finally, I will say, you know, these big questions that we're having about HBCUs, right? Sometimes we say, oh, we're looking for people to hire, but, you know, we can't find X, Y, and Z to do this. I'm like, no, I went to school with some of the best and brightest people that I've ever met in my life, and they exist in HBCUs. So I would say that that was really important for my journey.
Yeah. I find it so refreshing to hear someone who is not African American describe HBCUs that in such a special way. And it's also just like so jarring how you basically just described Spelman too. It's just like, no matter where you go in the States, no matter which HBCU you go to, you kind of get a certain thing from it. So thank you for sharing that. My next question will shift a little bit to focus more on Princeton and Africa. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit. But I would love to hear you talk about how you were first introduced to Princeton and Africa, and maybe what drew you to the executive director role.
Great question. So I first learned about Princeton and Africa in 2016. I actually had a friend who was at the African Leadership Academy in South Africa at the same time as a Princeton Africa Fellow at some point. And the person was like, oh, have you heard about this program? You should look into it. And I found it interesting. So I briefly looked, you know, at the website. I was like, oh, cool program, interesting mission. And that was it at the time. Sometimes I'll vaguely, so Yale has a similar program, not quite the same, but they have a similar program. So I'll drop in on all these different programs on the African continent. I'm like, okay, they're doing interesting work, but this is where I'm at. I'm at a nonprofit in DC implementing, you know, all these US Department of State programs. I think for me, during the pandemic, I don't know if it's the same for anyone, but during the pandemic, I started to ask myself all these big questions. It's like, the world is coming to an end. Okay, the world hasn't come to an end for you just yet, but what do you want to be doing in the next 5 years? What do I want to be doing, you know, in the next 10 years to make sure that I'm truly living a life that's dedicated to my long-term goals and my purpose. And a lot of those questions, I actually connected with one of the founders of the African Leadership Academy. We had talked extensively about the African continent, what my work and my role looks like on the African continent. So when this role opened up, it was just, I was applying to jobs. I was like, I'm focusing solely on Africa now. I've done Middle East, I've done Southeast Asia, I've done some Africa, but I would like to focus fully on the African continent. And I was applying for jobs and this role came up and the mission was really interesting. And I would say one thing that really caught my eye was really shifting how we engage on the African continent in a way that's ethical and more responsible. It's like, okay, I want to work here. So I applied. I did have multiple offers, but I ended up here and I am grateful because I think that the people are wonderful. Staff have been wonderful. Alum are incredible. Shout out to Jasmin and everyone who has made this such a welcoming experience, and to the board as well.
Oh, thank you. Kind of going with that question as well. I know you probably have tons of things that have prepared you, but my question is, what part of your professional experience would you say most prepared you for leading an organization like Piaf? So maybe you can just choose the one that you feel like most prepared you, or that sticks out to you the most, but I'm sure that that's a bigger answer.
I was thinking about that a lot. That's a really good question. I would say it's a combination of many things. I actually really thought about this question a lot. I'll say it's a combination of many things. First, from the, conceptually, I studied Africa for so long. And then on the personal aspect, I'm African. I grew up on the continent. It's not a concept to me. It's my home. I have a burden of responsibility, to my home. My personal mission, I always say, is to the leadership and to the institutions on the African continent. So there's that aspect. Then the second aspect of my professional experiences. So I've been over the last, 10, 11 years managing strategic directions and leadership, very recently at a faith-based nonprofit. But before being at the faith-based nonprofit, extensive program design, implementation, and management of U.S. Department of State programs, managing budgets ranging from $1 million to $13 million, through all the experiences that I've had, being able to navigate cross-cultural workspaces and managing the expectations of the stakeholders that you're working with. So whether that's the participants that you're putting together programs for, the donors who are making sure that we stay true to the objectives of our programs, teammates. And then I've also worked with governments, so that's state governments, local governments on the continent. I will say that those experiences prepared me for Princeton in Africa. But Princeton in Africa is very similar to places that I've been, but it's unlike anything else that I've ever worked at. I will say that.
Love that. So thus far, it's been about 6 months, and thus far, I think you've fully led and interacted with 2 cohorts. So the class of 2023 in orientation a couple months ago, and then class of 2022 in retreat, which was this past month. So hopefully this is a simple question, but based on and aside from that, you've also interacted with tons of amazing alumni. So what would you say stands out to you about Princeton in Africa Fellows based on your 6 months here and interacting with so many different fellows and alumni?
I've actually been here for 9 months.
9 months? Whoa.
And I know this because I've been here for 9 months. I know this because I'm coming up on 1 year, and
yes,
it's been an interesting last few months. One thing I will say that stands out and has been consistent, across Princeton and Africa Fellows and the alum that I've interacted with. It's the critical self-awareness and commitment to leadership that people have. So I've been in a lot of spaces where people are just not self-aware of how much space they occupy. You know, you're doing international development work, you're working on the African continent. What does my power look like? What does my privilege look like? And I'm coming into this space at Princeton Africa Fellows and alum, and we're having these conversations, and they're very critical conversations that people are taking seriously. And just being in that space, in that energy, in that room has been the most exciting thing for me. So it's like, okay, here is everything that has happened on the African continent. As we're going in, how are we being respectful? As we're engaging, how are we being respectful? I also like the fact that Piaf fellows and alum, they do not shy away from having difficult conversations. So you will hear it in an email, someone will write you a letter. You know, just all these questions that we're having about positionality, access, how are we making this organization or the work that we do on the African continent more inclusive, more respectful? I think that that's really big. I would also say that the alum are really engaged. So a lot of times when you think about alumni engagement, you know, you're thinking about it in terms of an endowment. But with Princeton in Africa, just seeing how involved the alum are, they're reading applications, they're mentoring other people, they're holding us accountable to the mission of the organization. I mean, we just held a retreat in Rwanda. We were in Rwanda with Jasmin. We also had alumni coordinators who volunteered their time, you know, to be there with us. I think that that's really incredible. This retreat that we just had in Rwanda, so we had not been in Rwanda. The first Princeton in Africa retreat that was held in Rwanda was 23 years ago. So we have not been in Rwanda as an organization since then. But the alum, they did the footwork. We had two alum who, you know, they went to the hotels, they looked up activities for us. That's how engaged people are. So it's not just, it goes with the tagline, service for a year, commitment for a lifetime. It's that commitment that I see in the fellows and the alum that makes this program really special.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. Okay, last question, and then we'll shift to a different topic, but I want to give you the opportunity to share anything else that you want about the work that your team has been doing over the last 9 months. I personally have seen you all put on orientation, an on-site retreat, and that's just in the last 2 or 3 months that I've been really engaged at this level. What else would you like to share with alumni and other stakeholders about the work that your team is doing and what might be coming up in the future?
Hi, team. Shout out, team. I see everyone on this call.
Shout out to the squad.
Seriously. Shout out to everyone's so incredible. Everyone works so hard. In the last 9 months, we've held 4 events in a program cycle where we would have held just 2 events. So we've held 4 programmatic events, a virtual mid-year retreat for 1 class, virtual orientation for 2 classes in March, and on-site retreat for 2 program classes. So the previous year that didn't get to go to the African continent, and the 2021 and 2022 fellowship class. And all of that is a lot in addition to the other moving pieces that we had. So, you know, the pandemic really shaped, you know, the face of exchange around the world. So our programs were fully remote. For over 2 years, Princeton in Africa was remote. The fellows and the host organizations were dedicated. But in the last 9 months, we've also been navigating how do we stay committed to the mission of this organization, which is getting leaders on the African continent and having them work and interact with people on the African continent. So there's also been a lot of moving pieces around health, safety, and security, and how do we transition back to the continent in a way that is safe and responsible. So we've been working on that, and I'm glad to say we are fully back on the African continent. The 2021 and 2022 class got to go to the African continent, be a part of their host organizations. The class is starting, some of them already started their fellowship. They're all going to be in person on the African continent. And the team was a huge part in making that happen. You know, in the last 9 months, we also brought on some new board members. We brought on 7 new board members.
Yes.
And these board members, you know, it's very exciting because, you know, they have experience on the African continent. They have expertise on the African continent. Some of them have African heritage. And it's just exciting that, you know, we've been able to do this over the last 9 months. We've also hosted multiple events, you know, outside of our regular programming to sort of change and add some cross-cultural aspect and some intellectual depth to our programming. So we've held speaker events. We've had alums speak at some of them. We've talked to the deputy director of the Africa CDC, who's now the director of the Africa CDC. We've talked to writers, you know, what does storytelling look like on the African continent, and really changing that narrative. And then as we were doing this, we're also managing relationships with host organizations. Yes. So, it's interesting. I will say shout out to the program team. Shout out to the program team. Yes. We're managing relationships with host organizations. We're checking in. We're making sure that we are all being held accountable to the same standards that we committed to. We're checking in with fellows. We provide quite a lot of support. That's another thing that's unique about Princeton in Africa, the hands-on support that we provide to the fellows. So we're also managing time and providing support to the fellows. And then there's the other aspects where we're trying to diversify our donor pool. And what does that look like? So the 9 months have been a lot. I was telling the team yesterday, I said, if you need a mental health day, please speak to your supervisor.
Yes.
Because it actually has been a lot. It's been a lot. So kudos and shout out to the team. And it's our hope, you know, now that we're back to full regular programming, that we go back to what our cycles used to look like, and really excited for all the new things that are coming.
Wow. It sounds like y'all are doing a lot. So, you know, Godspeed. I know most of you, actually, maybe even all of you, were doing site visits after retreat. So you just went right on to do site visits. So hopefully you all are much more well-rested now, because I know it took me about a week to recover from retreat. But I want to shift a little bit and talk about your perspective and some sociocultural aspects of the continent. And just to kind of even pair what we're talking about as far as host organizations that Princeton Africa has been working with and that you might have visited, based on our connecting and working together over the last few months, I've learned about your deep passion for education and Africa. And I know that you had the opportunity to visit African Leadership Academy here in South Africa. And then we also visited African Leadership University in Kigali, Rwanda. And I would just love to get your thoughts or your perspectives on these very innovative educational institutions and how you see their value and what they bring to the continent.
A really good question. I'm very excited about this question. So, I would say the first thing is space. Even just having that type of space where people across the continent can come together. There can be intercontinent exchange. If you're from Egypt, you're from Ghana, you're from Nigeria, Uganda, wherever you're from, you can come and exist in these spaces. It's something like we've never seen on the African continent before. You ask anyone that's African to ask their parents who didn't travel much. across the continent. We went to different places. We would go to London, we would go to the US, we would go to Italy, but did we go to Egypt? Did we go to Uganda? We didn't really connect with each other on that level. And now seeing this institutions like ALA and ALU that are bringing Africans from across the continent together in the same space on the continent, I think that that's so unique and that's really important. So even if that's the one thing that they've been able to accomplish, I would say kudos for that. Another thing I would say is African solutions to African problems. So you think a lot about education and John Dewey and this concept of learning by doing. You need to be able to touch and see and feel so that you can create solutions that are lasting so that you can learn long term. They've been able to create that space where we're not just adopting, what the West is telling us the progress of Africa looks like, but we are actually creating our own solutions and coming up with our own strategies on how to move the African continent forward. That's really important. I would also say that the innovation in leadership is very important because in the last, if you follow the African relations, right, there's been a huge boom of just innovation, technology. I feel like there's always some angel investor somewhere and someone has finally hit X, Y, and Z. So many entrepreneurs, even from small scale entrepreneurs, right? What does that look like? Because that seems to be something that is very peculiar to us and we do it really well on the African continent. And now we're building the capacity of people on the African continent in a way that they're equipped, to really scale their businesses and create lasting solutions for the continent. I think that that's really important. So for those two reasons at all, kudos to ALA and ALU. And then for allowing us to be part of that mission, which I think also speaks to the why of Princeton in Africa, right? We're placing our fellows with some of the most impactful organizations on the African continent, just shifting how we engage with Africa. So grateful that we can be partners with ALA and ALU in the future.
Yes, shout out to ALA and ALU and their founders. We love them. That was a very
quick plug.
Sure.
I'm gonna quick plug. I'm sorry, Jasmin. Okay, so the current CEO of ALU is a Princeton in Africa alum. Shout out to Princeton in Africa, who was placed at the African Leadership Academy during his fellowship year, and he stayed on, at the organization, and now he's pioneering their work in Rwanda and Mauritius. So that's very exciting to see as well.
Very exciting. Veda is definitely a force. And I think that we might have the career panel recorded that we did with Veda and myself and a few other Princeton Africa alumni during the retreat. So if you are watching this video and you want to hear a little bit more about Veda's journey going from a Princeton Africa fellow at ALA to now being the leader of African Leadership University, it's definitely worth a watch, I would say, for sure. So Dami, what misconception about Africa would you ban forever if you could? What is one thing or something that you want people to know and get right about the continent? Please don't make me laugh too hard. I already know.
So many things, but I'll try and keep our conversation PG. But I will say one thing that's, just this idea that in order for Africa to develop, we must look like Western countries. I want to banish that forever. I want to banish the misconceptions that Africa is poor, or we have to go and save Africa, or Africa is not safe. I would like to wipe all of those from the surface of the continent, because it is a continent that's filled with people who have dignity and pride in our history. in where we've come from and the institutions that we've been able to develop and how we've been able to forge ahead in spite of the challenges and how we've built our economies from nothing to become something. And all these institutions that have, you know, educated the African world leaders that we look at that exist on the continent, that are making a difference on the African continent, but also around the world. We develop our own solutions, and shout out to Princeton in Africa, because our fellows get to see it firsthand. You know, African organizations, they develop their own solutions. They're solving their own problems. We can tell our own stories. So, you know, while it's wonderful that we have all this aid and Western involvement, we welcome them as collaborators, but not as the primary storytellers of what Africa looks like or what Africa should look like, I would say.
I love that. You welcome the West as collaborators. Very well put. Okay, so this is my burning question personally, but I'm going to try to keep it a little bit short because we are running out of time and I still have a bunch of questions to get to. But as one person who is from the continent and who has also lived in the US, who's also went to an HBCU, I'm sure that you have heard and have experienced what some people might call like the Diaspora Wars. And I would just like to ask, what do you think unity across the diaspora looks like? And do you feel like it's already happening?
That's a big question that I tried to answer.
We might need to take it offline.
My final paper in college.
Really? Okay.
That is a very big question. Yes. And actually put together a focus group. Put together a focus group of Africans and African Americans. Let's answer this question. Let's get together in the same room and really answer this question. I think that that's an interesting question. I will go back to the concept of space. Just get us in the same room and get us to know each other outside of all these misconceptions that we built over time that sometimes also has outside influences in how we see each other, I will say. Secondly, I would say that storytelling and technology has changed that a little bit as well. So, you know, years ago, it's like, oh, I don't want to associate with Africans. Now, everyone wants to listen to Burna Boy. Everyone's listening to Wizkid. It's like we're listening to our own music. So we're, as much as we've appreciated American culture, I feel like there is now that mutual appreciation of African culture, African food, African clothing. And then in 2019, that was the big year of the return, you know, 400 years since people were forcefully taken away through the slave trade and brought to the US. So there's this big conversation around the year of the return, people coming back to the African continent and learning their roots. So you see Afrochella, you see people coming on the continent. And then with HBCUs are educating some of the brightest and the best, like I said earlier, but you look at the stats of doctors across the US, the African ones, all HBCUs. You look at Africans who are doing incredible things, all HBCUs. Look at the vice president, educated at a HBCU. So we're building that bridge, I will say. It's taking time, but I think that there's now more unity. And I'm very excited for programs like Princeton in Africa to continue to do that, you know, if people want to learn about the African continent and, you know, going back and what that looks like through a Princeton in Africa fellowship.
That's a great answer. It makes me happy, especially as an African-American living in South Africa. I too feel like you can definitely see it coming together, just a little slower than I'd like, but it's fine. We're moving. And for the last question or two, because I know we have about 16 minutes left and I promised 15 minutes for questions from the viewers. But there is one question I really want to ask, you know, as president of the Princeton Africa Alumni Board. And you all know, today's in conversation with discussion is really being held by the Alumni Board, which was created only in 2019 to support the mission and success of Princeton Africa and its alumni, and really to support fellows in the process as well. Dami, I would love if you could talk a little bit about the vision that you see for the alumni community as it relates to engagement, or the future of Princeton Africa, or the vision you have for Piaf. Would love to hear your perspective on the alumni community.
Very big question. I will try and answer in two parts. I think those are two questions. What does alumni engagement look like? And then, for the vision of Princeton in Africa, what role can alum play? Or, how do you stay engaged with alum? I will say one thing that I've been toying with and thinking about a lot, especially at this retreat that we just had in Rwanda, what does commitment for a lifetime look like for the alumni community? I will say continued donations to organizations in Africa. You look at the stats of Princeton in Africa, and you see that quite a number of our alum stay back on the African continent. Yeah. So that's a big deal in itself. What does continued mentorship look like, for alum? So whether you're signing up for the alumni mentorship program, or you're mentoring someone more unofficially, as the program is opened up over the last 10 years, there's been a shift in what the cohorts look like in terms of how people identify, what type of support are alum able to provide for people who have a certain identity. It's not their predominant identity that participates on this program. How can I support this person when they're on the African continent? I will say continued volunteering and donation to organizations that work on the African continent. So this one, I would say, would love to explore more over the next few years. How do you ensure that, alum who are interested, so, maybe you are dedicated to the African continent, but you just don't know how to give back. How do you continue to give back with organizations that are doing the work on the African continent? And we have such a large pool of organizations, right? Over the last 23 years, we've worked with over 100 organizations. So we have such a large pool. How do we support you in, how you plan to give back? Or if you're interested in giving back to Princeton in Africa, what does that look like for you? I will say also connecting us to your own professional development network. So how do we spread the word about Princeton in Africa so that more people can have opportunity and access to this program? And then there's the Alumni Job Network. I feel like I get an email every single day. There's a new job, someone is in a new city. So we're planning on cultivating that more. I'm really excited to see that. And then there are all these events that you all put together. I've been very excited to see the Alumni Board, over my last 9 months here, engaging with you. What does that look like? How do we get our alum more engaged? The events that we've talked about, such as this one, which is now happening, the regional meetups that happen. And then as an organization, how do we support and give back to the alumni community, which is why we pioneered the alumni mini grants. So, as you're giving back your skills, knowledge, and expertise to Princeton in Africa, how do we give back to you? So we just pioneered the alumni mini grants. You all should have received information about that. Alum are able to apply for grants to meet personal or professional development needs. So I really encourage you to take a look at that. I will say long-term as an organization, we had a strategic priorities retreat when I first came on with the staff team, and really talk about what are some of our big priorities over the next 2 to 5 years. And we outlined a few that I'd like to share. So first is institutional development. So we'd like to continue to support more mission-driven and leading organizations on the African continent with talented individuals who contribute to their organization's effectiveness, and also making sure that those partners feel supported and like the relationship is equal between us and them. What type of professional development opportunities do we also provide for the institutions that we work with? The second one is cultivating leaders. So leaders who use their skills, knowledge, and experiences to change their organizations and communities. So that aspect of commitment for a lifetime, what does that look like after my 1 year of fellowship on the African continent? So we are working on initiatives, some of which have already happened. I would say cross-cultural learning. So a huge aspect of the Princeton Africa Fellowship focuses on, it's a job and you have to be at work. But we are also, and we started incorporating this, right, in the experiences at the retreat that we just had. What does cross-cultural learning look like? How do you get to know people that you're actually working and engaging with outside of work? What does it look like socially, politically, culturally in the countries and communities that you're entering, and how do you engage? And then creating a strong alumni network. So we will. The alum are the best. I feel like there's always something exciting happening. Oh, an alum is giving a TED talk, an alum is written a book. So creating this alumni network where we can celebrate your impact in the world and how this Princeton and Africa experience has shaped you, and being able to demonstrate the value of other people being a part of this network. I always tell people that I don't know if anyone on this call did Peace Corps, but if you see Peace Corps alums, they stick together. And, just really excited for that to be a Princeton and Africa experience. And then amplifying African thought leadership. This one is big because we've been on the continent for 23 years. We know what we're doing. It's not just, it's a nice program, let's just send people. We have been doing this for 23 years. So how do we amplify and bolster African expertise through the platform that we already have? How do we amplify our own brand? How do we bring more Africans and involve them in the conversation and how we're moving and how we're stewarding, this organization? Which is how do we also involve more African philanthropists in the work that we're doing? How do we bring on new African board members? And you can see some of the things that we've done over the last 9 months truly reflect that. I don't know if everyone else has heard this, but I think Jazz, you were at the orientation. Thank you. You volunteered your time once again. But one thing that we've also been talking about is the possibility of having Africa Fellows, on the Princeton and Africa program. So we're working through that right now. And then also having office space on the African continent. So if anyone would like to talk more about that or would like to share any resources, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yes, I love that. I love the idea of the possibility of African fellows, especially as it relates to really just sharing cross-culturally, and also getting Piaf on the ground on the continent. Also, I'm really excited about that. We have 7 minutes left in this very engaging conversation. I want to open up the floor for anyone to drop any questions that you might have. Feel free to just drop them in the chat. I can read them, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom. I have 2 more questions that I can also ask, which will probably take us over time. But I just want to open it up and give people the opportunity to ask any questions. I must have asked all the good ones. I asked some pretty heavy ones. But in the meantime, I do have one question that I could ask. It's a little bit it's a little similar to the one that you just answered, but maybe a little more specific to what Princeton in Africa will look like in the future. So I understand the way that alumni engagement will evolve as Piaf evolves, but maybe, and this is really why I wanted to have the conversation with you in the first place. I really think it's helpful for alumni, fellow stakeholders to know what your vision is for Princeton Africa as its leader. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is your vision for Princeton Africa? I was gonna say, we just celebrated 23 years not too long ago. Like, in the next 23 years, how do you see Princeton in Africa? But maybe a more simple way to just put that question is, what is your vision for Piaf? What are some goals that you're thinking of for the organization?
I would say primary one is, just building the next generation of leaders and African change makers, whether that's in public policy, community health, international development, and that could be on both sides. So having North America fellows, but also having Africa fellows. And that really changes the discourse of what commitment for a lifetime looks like, and what sustainability on the African continent looks like. So, as we have fellows who are going to the continent for a full year, what does sustainability and development look like for those countries, for those communities and spaces that you're entering? So being able to build the capacity of those next generation of leaders. I would say fostering more global networks. So there's this big conversation that's currently happening in the US about US Africa policy. And I think Piaf alum are rightly positioned. I also think Piaf is rightly positioned to be a part of that conversation. How do we foster this network of people who have lived and worked on the African continent and who have the expertise and something to contribute to the conversation in how we engage with Africa economically, socially, politically, in a way that's not stuck in 1940 or 1960. How do we move away from that? And then I would say continuing to create this strong pipeline of, our talent pool. And that's something that's very peculiar to the Princeton Africa program. The program team, they spend so much time on the placement process, and it shows in the quality of fellows that we end up with. How do we continue to cultivate this strong pipeline of leaders who are committed to institutions, not just from a job level, but intellectually, they're committed to the infrastructure. And I think all of that truly happens with us, again, having space on the African continent so that we can work with our host organizations on the African continent. If there's a problem, we can say, oh, I'll see you in Johannesburg, and really having conversations with people in person. I was telling one of the staff members this, Amina and I, we joke about this all the time, of how professionalism in Africa looks very different than what American professionalism looks like. And that doesn't make either one better. It's just what it is. There's more Ubuntu where you have to relate with people in person. So definitely having space on the African continent, and then diversifying our programs and our funding pool, I would say is really important. So what type of other new programs can we offer on the African continent that have to do, with long-term leadership and long-term institution building? I would say are some of the things that we're working on. And if you all, this is just my shameless pitch to the alumni community, as we're thinking of all these new initiatives and diversifying what our programs could potentially look like over the next few years, if you have resources that you would like to share with us, this is your program. Please do not hesitate to write me an email. Do not hesitate to send me a message. Be in touch. If there are funding pools that we can tap into, please let us know. I would love to explore that more with the community.
Awesome. Well, we are at the 7:59 mark. I mean, the 1:59 mark, excuse me. 7:59 for me. But I just want to say I enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you for making time after you just wrapped up retreat and what sounds like a very busy 9 months at Piaf already. I just really thought it was important to the entire alumni board, but we really thought it was important to have this conversation with you and just give the people some insight as to who you are. And we are all very excited for your leadership. Like I said, I mean, I've been working with you for the last few months. It's been great. And I'm really excited to see what you and your team continue to do and how you will be pushing Princeton Africa forward. So thank you again for joining us today and answering these questions and being so engaging.
I would like to say thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Jasmin for being such a wonderful facilitator and making this possible. And thank you to everyone for joining and giving us 1 hour of your time.
Sweet. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks,
Bye,
Liz.
everyone.